All right, good to see everybody. I know more people are going to be trickling in, but I want to get started on time. And I'm really excited about this topic about imposter syndrome. And I was talking to Andrea earlier, and it's like I remember hearing her say it on here, and I'm like, and I saw this article, and I'm like, yes, this is going to be a topic that can be very exciting. But I had no idea where it was going to go. But part of the other thing that stirred my memory is I've been doing a whole lot of sims the last couple of days, and I heard a student say that they felt like they were during the scenario, they felt like they were an imposter and they just plowed through, not feeling like they didn't know what they were doing, hoping no one would figure that out. And they plowed through, made good decisions, and then we had a good debriefing afterwards. So I thought, do students have imposter syndrome too? Because I know faculty do, right? So that's why I dove into this. And like I said in my calendar invite, I apologize. There were 3 articles, but I found this systematic review, and I was like, I wanted to get down to the basics of, what basically do we know? And I thought I know about what imposter syndrome is, but I wanted to make sure that my interpretation was correct. So this first systematic review, I really hate reading stuff like this, so I gleaned it, and what I wanted to do was go, okay, what I figured out was the SIPs, I can't remember what it's exactly called, is the instrument of choice. I'm like, okay, I'm good with that. I can put this article away. And then I went to the second article, which is the one about simulation educators, which used the SIPs tool. And, Clance imposter phenomenon scale. So this article, just briefly, because I encourage people, I said, if you don't get to the articles, go ahead and come and you'll glean something out of the journal club. So the study investigated the prevalence of imposter syndrome in simulation educators, which really hadn't occurred to me. However, I know it truly, and examined the effect of work-related characteristics on imposter phenomenon in the simulation educator community. And I like articles that come out of other countries because it goes, are we doing the same thing as everybody else? Or are we just in our little United States silo, right? But we're not. Everybody's doing this. Well, so they use the Clance imposter phenomenon scale. 46.6% of simulation educators identified as having imposter syndrome, like almost half of them. And I found that very, very interesting. And then it doesn't discriminate on gender or other demographic stuff, and it does not disappear with experience and is present regardless of the team. That just kind of blew me away. And so bringing these authors say, bringing the conversation into the open is a first step to acknowledging feelings of imposterism and developing strategies to break the cycle. In their discussion, I liked their imposter syndrome cycle of having a new job or task. So does imposter syndrome come back when now you're teaching a new class and it's a new topic or a new scenario that you haven't done before? And that, as the simulation manager, that informed me of how much different kind of support I need to give to faculty. And this supports what I have to tell my dean to say, no, this requires more time of me, because yes, they're a accomplished facilitator, but they haven't done this one before, right? And I've had to have that conversation. She's like, that makes sense to me. So now I have some evidence. Studies suggest also that social support can be an effective strategy to break the cycle and alleviate the negative impacts of imposterism. I like that word. So part of my job is faculty development. And so I was really happy to find this article to inform more how I can support our facilitators. And it blew me away that it doesn't decrease over time and that it keeps cycling. So there's that. comments, thoughts on that article?
Susie, I'm wondering, did the article state, because I didn't read that article, the article state whether that imposter syndrome continued over time because there were different or new simulation scenarios put in? Or is it people who are doing the same scenarios over and over experience that as well?
My assumption is going to be that it's no matter how much experience you have, they weren't really explicit, one, to answer your question. But my assumption is no matter how much experience you have, if you're given a new one, imposter syndrome will come back.
Yeah, and I would have to agree with that because I know even myself being, a content expert in something, because you just never know how where the students are going to take it and that unknown, and to be able to um, shift on the fly like that can really definitely make you really, yeah, I could see how. But if it's a scenario, I mean, I think about some of our scenarios, one that I've done over and over and over, and you anticipate, like, I know where the problems are going to be. Like those, I feel like I always come out of those feeling like, okay, I had that. I knew how to, I was able to anticipate, I knew how to do it. But man, you put a new scenario in there and it's kind of like, ooh, yeah, I can see.
Allison?
So in the study, it talked about that they needed to have a clear definition of what imposter syndrome is, that it wasn't clearly defined from kind of like when people are using that term. And I see our students talk about, oh, it's imposter syndrome, it's imposter syndrome, but that there's kind of this like, it's not necessarily conceptualized from like one person to another. I think when you hear the word imposter syndrome, you're kind of like, well, I can kind of like guess, but what that may be for one person to another person, we don't necessarily know exactly what that could be defined as. But I think that I have definitely heard it from enough students that I don't know if we bring it up or talk about it in our program at all. So it kind of makes me want to investigate if we bring that up in the earlier parts of our program, because it definitely is something that I hear frequently. And then Chris had a question about anxiety, and I don't know if you're going to talk about that article next, but there was prevalence with anxiety in the other article.
Yeah, I was gonna talk about this one and then that one.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so I found that was very interesting, but
Mm-hmm.
it makes me want to look back at our curriculum to see if we've actually if we talk about it with students, because I really see them struggle. I see them kind of so me talking about it's not truly, or people have a hard time conceptualizing like an actual definition that they can agree with, is that I see students earlier on try to verbalize what they're feeling. And when I work with them fifth quarter, they're all saying, I have imposter syndrome. So it's interesting kind of seeing that development of them progressing through the program, that they put a name to it, but in the first and the second, third quarter, they're just trying to struggle with how they're feeling, but they don't have a name yet.
Mm-hmm. I think also in nursing, I mean, for my entire life, I've heard the phrase fake it till you make it. And I think that feeds that. I think that feeds that syndrome or that phenomenon. Some places they call it imposter phenomenon. But in the article, it says it's described as an internal feeling of intellectual phoniness. It's where an individual experiences the overwhelming feeling that any minute now they'll be found out and that someone will discover that they're a fraud. Yelena.
I'd like to poke some holes into this research article. Well, for one, the clans scale actually measures, because I dug it out and I looked at what questions they ask. So there are 4 different categories where they place the responders. Those who have few attributes of imposter syndrome, I guess, a moderate, frequently, and intense. And it wasn't clear to me where the authors of the first article made the cutoff as to, yes, they have this syndrome. No, they don't have that syndrome, because that's all they gave us, right? 50%. Oh, yes, they have imposter syndrome. So that was question number one. Two, they didn't really clarify. I was super surprised that even with a lot of experience, people are still saying that they have those qualities. But they did not clarify if it's with a new task or with a new simulation or with a new job or things like that. So, and then the last thing that I don't know if sincerely rubbed me the wrong way, but I questioned, I guess, is, oh, we have to break this cycle. And then there were no recommendations on how to break that cycle. Sure, they brought the awareness and we see it, but I guess future research is needed as to how to break that cycle. Those were my thoughts about that article. And then I was thinking, well, what's imposter versus being just humble? Because if you ask, like, say, hey, do you feel that you did this job awesomely great? I don't know how many people would say 100%. So I don't know. It's a little bit softy. And I think a good portion of this feeling is absolutely imperative to have, especially in nursing.
What you just said there at the last, Yelena, could you say that again?
I'm saying it's important to be a bit humble in the nursing profession so that you don't make errors. We don't want to necessarily to strive to believe that we know it all. I don't know if I took it too far, but those were my thoughts.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, this article is like, it's at the very beginning of talking about this and looking at it and researching it. That was one of the things I found so exciting, because they're like, no one else has even tried to look at this before. We just have talked about it, and it's this kind of woo-woo, undefined phenomenon. But I can't tell you how many times I've heard new faculty up and down the hallway going, I feel like I'm an imposter in their first couple of years of teaching. And I'm like, yeah, that's the thing.
I would also be interested to see if there's a correlation with the students, not so much the instructors, but with the students, if there's a correlation between cognitive load and imposter syndrome, because we do know that students sometimes are trying to focus on so many aspects and they want to be perfect and they don't want to make a mistake and they're trying to remember, all the stuff we teach them while they're performing. So I wonder if increased cognitive load also affects that, because I know a friend of mine did her dissertation on cognitive load and simulation, which was very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I go to these big conferences and there are these people who've been there all the time that I've been in simulation, and they're there and they're doing publishing, in fancy places, and I get imposter syndrome going, oh, maybe I really don't know what I know. All right, you ready to move to the next one? All right. This next article, prevalence of imposter syndrome and its association with depression, stress, and anxiety among nursing students. This study, the object was to examine the prevalence of imposter syndrome among nursing students and its association with depression, stress, and anxiety. So it's a multi-center cross-sectional survey. They used the Clance imposter phenomenon scale, also the depression anxiety scale, which I wasn't familiar with. I thought Chris might give us some insight on that. This study found about the same amount, 46.3% of students experience moderate imposter syndrome. And this study highlighted specifically female students with lower grade point averages, living in urban areas, lower family incomes, and not participating in hobbies were more prone to depression, anxiety, and stress. The nursing implications are that we need to have a holistic approach to managing the complex nature of mental health among nursing students. incorporating education and resources on self-care and stress management techniques into nursing programs, and address the implications of imposter syndrome in nursing practice. This study took place in Egypt. I found it interesting that they had to, they had to translate the tool into Arabic, and then they did a pilot study to make sure the translation was valid. They talked a lot about lack of social networks for these nursing students who had higher levels of depression and anxiety. They used the same scale, the Clance Imposter Syndrome scale. So what struck me with this study, again, it was one of the first studies that's been done. Oh, I wanted to say the one about educators, all of that data was collected during the pandemic. And they wondered if that influenced the findings. And thinking about what we had to do, because we kept our program open and running and turned all of our clinicals into simulation in like a week. And everybody had to go into virtual simulation, all the clinical instructors, and how stressful that was. And I know lots of people are just plowing through the best they could, if that influenced those findings. This says anxiety over making mistakes or failing under pressure can contribute to the development of imposter syndrome among nursing students. And this made me jump totally to, because I had written an email to somebody from another school saying, how do you do this sim like this? And how do you do it like this? I'm like, well, we don't do that, because our philosophy of simulation is that you make mistakes in simulation, and then we debrief that, and then you learn from that, and it's okay. We give you total permission to make mistakes in simulation. So running a simulation the way we do, can that help imposter syndrome and decreasing their anxiety? Coming back to what you brought up, Allison. So the study uncovered a significant positive correlation between imposter syndrome and the psychological outcomes of depression, anxiety, and stress among nursing students. There you have it. Any thoughts?
Interesting that you brought up the pandemic and the data collection and how that might have impacted. And I literally am just making straight across associations right now going, oh, that's an example of external validity being impacted by historical events that have nothing to do with so that's just where I am in my process, my journey. So that's all. I know that's low level, but it's just like, that's just where I am right now. So no, but very, very valid, a very valid point that, I wonder if somebody were to repeat that, if it would, we would have different data now. And especially, and I think that the regulations being in place to standardize how and inform how programs are implementing simulation, I think that those are huge changes and very important. So
yeah, that's a good point, as well as requiring simulation professional development for facilitators under situations. I think that's going to have a huge impact.
Because I mean, you're absolutely right. We just winged it and prayed.
Allison?
So I know that you talked about the being female student, lower GPAs. I've got my notes on another screen. So, and then students residing in urban areas, individuals from lower income families. So for our program who has holistic admissions, this definitely made me consider how we all need to be very aware of this in our student population, but especially for nursing programs that have holistic admissions or are considering holistic admissions, because they're implications, we're talking about integrating mental health support services, providing that resource on self-care and stress management, and fostering environments that address imposter feelings and promote resilience, like you had brought up, Susie. So just kind of looking at what are we doing for our students? What could we be always doing better for our students? Because when I look at all of those risk factors, it's pretty much all of our, a majority of our students fall under those categories.
Yeah, but if you look at the population in this study, it looks like they were almost all traditional age college students and in an Arab culture.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the generalizability is going to be sketchy.
Yeah.
I
But
still
I
like
get it.
and I agree with Allison too. I like how these research articles make us, make other leaps into other thoughts. Um, I was surprised, and to me, it was a little bit of cultural awareness where women face higher expectations in that culture and harsher judgment and expected academically and professionally. Um, I thought that was pretty interesting and definitely expanded my cultural horizons.
Mhm. So in the chat, Chris says, oh, you want to say, Chris?
Oh yeah, I've been putting stuff in the chat because the dogs keep barking. I don't want to interrupt anybody. Yeah, no, I was just wondering, I was just curious to know like those who suffer from anxiety already, like coming into the simulation scenarios, do they have higher rates of imposter syndrome versus those who because they measured imposter syndrome as well as depression, anxiety. So it's almost like the chicken and the egg. We don't really know which came first. But obviously, having imposter syndrome would increase your anxiety, I'm sure. But I'm just interested to know how many suffered from anxiety before they even went into nursing school and how that affected them.
Well, to both the authors' credit, they all say we need a whole lot more research on this. Mm.
That would be a good study for us to do as a group with all of our free time, of course.
Well, does anybody have a master's student soon?
No, but that's a good thing to think about.
Yeah.
Mm. I don't know. What do you think, as a simulation educator, what do you think would be beneficial to decrease imposter syndrome?
I would, sorry, Chris, I would definitely, first off, naming it and identifying it, I think is the initial key.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think just normalizing it by talking about it, kind of like I teach them in mental health that if you normalize the conversation around like suicide assessment, then it's not so taboo or stigmatized. So maybe just talking about it, say, listen, we've all been there. We all understand what you're going through. Some of you may, feel like you're suffering from what we call imposter syndrome, like you really don't belong here, but you do belong here. It's part of your growth. And like Susie said, this is where you make your mistakes. This is where you do a lot of your learning.
Yeah, I think we're doing a lot of normalizing in the pre-brief. I think we're just not naming like imposter syndrome.
I
What
think
about, go ahead.
I think it would, I think that's a good point, Chris. I think we need, I think this conversation is really important because I'm wondering, because I, I always tell students in simulation that if they get anything out of simulation is just learning how they deal with stress. In these simulations, I mean, if they don't get anything else out of that, just how did they deal with that stress that they were feeling at the time? Because they're going to experience that in real life. And what are some tools that they can use to decrease that stress? Because I tell them when you're stressed like that, you can't operate under a crisis or an emergency. And so sometimes that's all we talk about is how do we decrease that stress level? I'm just wondering, I mean, I think those are important tools to teach our students because it'd be really interesting to do a study on imposter syndrome in their first year of nursing or their first 6 months of nursing. And if that contributes to them leaving nursing, and not just having the tools to deal with that feeling. Because I can remember as a brand new nurse practitioner, I'll tell you, my first several months, it was like, what am I doing? Who do I think I am that I can come in here and, you know, do this? It took me a while to get over. I mean, I needed some, you know, confidence building. So I'm just wondering, and how are residency programs, you know, are they even addressing that, right? And so I think anything that we can do in our program to help students with that feeling and to be able, like you said, Allison, to be able to put a name to it and recognize that that's what they're feeling. And then here are the tools that you can use because when you go out into practice, you're going to feel the very same thing.
I'm curious if, I think, was it last month that we talked about the emotional word wheel? And I brought it up. And so I started implementing it last week and it was amazing. But I wonder because that makes them put a word to the feeling. If that could help us tie that to identifying imposter syndrome. I'm gonna think about that. Because that's been like amazing this past week and a half.
Susie, can you tell us a little bit more how amazing it was? Or what, like some examples or anything?
So, for example, in the capstone, they do a code. They have no idea what they're supposed what they're doing, and then we rewind the scenario, and they do a code the same way, only differently, and they run it. They don't need any help to do it because we've debriefed it so using so much deliberate practice and repetition and rapid cycle practice that they know what to do. And at the end of each debrief, or the beginning of each debrief, I ask the nurses to give them the wheel and I say, pick a word before we say anything else, pick a word that describes how you're feeling. And they picked a word in the first debrief, and then the words they picked in the second debrief were like on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of confidence and comfort. It was like dramatic. But to be able to like put words to it was huge. And what I found was that if they could pin it down to a word, then they could talk about it. Where otherwise we would say, hey, how are you feeling now that you've done this? We would get a lot of, I'm fine. I'm good. I'm glad it's over. I was like, that's not a feeling, right? So that's one example. But another example, what happened yesterday, it was like, well, what are you feeling? And he says, restricted. And he's an EMT, and he said, it was an asthma exacerbation scenario, and he said, if a patient needs oxygen, I just put oxygen on. I don't go and look at the orders because I have standing orders. And it's like, well, yeah, but you've memorized those standing orders and you know protocol, so you know that put oxygen on is in those orders. But that's part of your practice. But as a nurse, you have to do things a little differently. And but restricted was a very interesting word, I thought. But I don't think he would have talked about that feeling and complexity to his practice without starting with one word. Where his partner in the scenario was a young woman with very little medical experience, if any. And she said, I know, I was so overwhelmed because you kept saying we need to put oxygen on him. And I'm like, I can't do that without an order. Right. And so I don't think she would have felt free to have that conversation if we hadn't started with the one word overwhelmed. So Amanda writes, in my opinion, there's a pressure of perfection in nursing. As an instructor, highlighting their successes and growth, even if it is not meeting perfect. I feel that prompting reflection throughout the process is important for them to see their own growth in their knowledge and abilities. Yeah.
When I did my dissertation on moral distress, a lot of nurses talked about something called hermeneutical. So I had to look up what it was called. It's called hermeneutical injustice. And so hermeneutical is like the study of being able to use your words to discuss and communicate what it is that you're trying to feel. And so I think that it's interesting that you're wanting to kind of link or tie this emotional wheel to also imposter syndrome, because so many people are having these feelings, but they can't necessarily communicate because they don't have the tools in their vocabulary to say what it is that they're feeling. And so that example of he needed this word restricted to be able to start the conversation. And a lot of this hermeneutical injustice also comes from, when I'm looking at those, a white female or we're going through education, a lot of people feel that there's this privilege tied to, again, I'm going through education, I'm white, I don't have a lot of things that I should feel that I can complain about or that I should complain about because I'm very lucky to be getting an education. And I feel very privileged to be going into healthcare where I'm going to be getting a job. So for me to complain or say that I have imposter syndrome can be cultural or it could be something. So I'm not going to say that I'm struggling with something because I find myself very privileged to be here. So there's a lot of also components. If I'm linking what I understand from moral distress to also imposter syndrome, is that a lot of people have a hard time even saying that they're struggling with this. And that also goes and plays into what Linda was saying too about how much does this play into people getting burnt out or leaving the profession because they don't know how to say that they're struggling because they feel so lucky to be in this position to begin with. So I really, really like your idea of giving them words to use to start a conversation. And I think that could be a study.
So many studies. Well, and the way I sell it to the students, the way I have sold it to the students is that some of us grow up with a large vocabulary of feeling words, and some of us do not. And it can depend on so many things, including culture. And they all go, oh yeah, right, because they know that. And so they're forced to pick one, and everybody's forced to pick one, they love it. They ended up, before the end of the day, because we run like 5 scenarios in a day, they'll jump down in their chairs and grab the wheel. And this one student came in and she's like, I have a feeling, I don't know what it is. And she grabs the wheel and finds it. Yeah, so Allison says this could be beneficial for neurodivergent students. And Chris says, reflection is good for increasing emotional literacy, which is lacking in some students. And some people are people pleasers too. So they try to say what they think others want to hear. Kristen says, I think it's important to provide the environment to be able to say we are struggling without fear of judgment. And that's for faculty too.
So
I just-
I have an interesting something that just came up yesterday talking to family. I'm from this community, and so I know a lot of these students because my children were friends with these students. And some of the, I heard this yesterday and it didn't even occur to me, said, yeah, this student felt like they had to do really well because they knew me. And so it made me kind of think about, wow. I mean, it didn't even occur to me that that would be something that they would be worried about. So I think, again, I have a little interesting dynamic because I didn't even think about that before. And we have had lots of students, and especially recently, go through that, are friends with my kids and they know me. And so to have that perspective also, it was kind of interesting. So yeah, and I think, Allison, when you talk about this, our holistic admission, and again, you know, the population that we're bringing into our program, I think that wheel is so important to use to help them, like you said, Chris, to help with that emotional literacy, because we just got to give them the words that they know what to say. Because a lot of times, you know, and as advisors as well, you know, to use that wheel to talk about like how they're feeling, I think is, I mean, I think that opens up conversations. So.
Yeah, it's definitely has repeatedly given an opportunity to normalize emotions with the students. Now that we know, now that they can verbalize what they are feeling.
It was interesting when last year when I had that clinical group or that fieldwork group, and I remember the facilitator saying, you know, well, how are you guys all feeling? And you know, the only words that they could come up was stressed. I feel stressed. And then she pulled out that wheel and we passed, or she had one for all the students and we used it. And it was really interesting how every student had a different word for what stress meant to them. And so that to me was a real eye opener on that, on just the use of that wheel. Yeah.
The one word we discovered is not on there that perhaps could be added is discombobulated. You know, it was hard to find a substitution for them.
I wonder what we could do to make that more culturally. I wonder if there's a word that would be more culturally recognized, because that one's a very, like I wouldn't put that on the NCLEX.
Yeah.
It's a great word though.
Yeah, Chris, so many studies, so little time. But I think, you know, starting with conversations like this is a great place to get started. And if we can't do the studies, we have this. We have conversations. Thinking about back to simulation educators, given my duties for faculty development, I'm wondering if there's anything more specific you all could think about, because you've all been in the situation where, oh, guess what? Now we're going to do a new one. that could support, and maybe not that you have imposter syndrome, but to keep that cycle from starting up. Do you know what I mean? Frustrated, a combo of flustered and frustrated. Oh, I was frustrated yesterday. All right. Well, I'm going to put the survey form, the link in the chat. And share my screen with the QR code. Work. Can you guys see the QR code? And later today, I will post the articles for next month. Bradley's going to do articles on AI generation and simulation.
Cool.
Yeah. And I appreciate you all coming. It was nice discussion.
Thank you for finishing just a tad early since we have another meeting at 9 o'clock.
Yeah, for the next 3 hours.
I know.
I
Thank
figure it
you.
takes so long to read the articles and study them that if you do those and you're here for 45 minutes, that's an hour of professional development for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susie, so much.
You're
Thank
welcome,
you.
Elena. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you.